The United Nations General Assembly has 193 seats, one for each country, kinda, and all of them get exactly one vote when they make decisions. Sovereign equality for the win. But as you may know, the General Assembly isn't the UN's only organ. In fact, there are a bajillion of them. And not all of them agree that sovereign equality is all it's cracked up to be. Some organs allow countries that aren't even allowed in the General Assembly. Some organs restrict how many members can be a part of it. And some organs require countries to work together to achieve even one single seat. The brawls over the seats of the various UN organs are part of what I like to call the UN seat metagame. Yes, I'm a gamer, how could you tell? Each organ has its own metagame that can tell us a lot about how countries navigate the world of international politics to put themselves in a good position. So let's go over some of those, starting with... Okay, so when I say one for each country, kinda, the kinda is the key word. While most of this map looks nice and blue, representing the entire world being part of the UN General Assembly, there are still some tiny little splotches of differently colored paint on the canvas which have not joined the Cool Kids Club yet. There used to be many more of them, which the UN called trust territories and non-self-governing territories. It then declared all of them to be deserving of self-determination in Resolution 1514, which was adopted in 1960 alongside the mildly annoyed abstentions of the former colonial powers. And also the Dominican Republic. Bro thinks he's on the team. Every single trust territory has since gained independence, with the final one having been Palau in 1994. A great success for the UN Trusteeship Council. But of course that also means that the Trusteeship Council is now completely unemployed. That's what you get for doing too good of a job. Always remember to quiet quit. The non-self-governing territories are a different story though, and today there are still 17 of them. There's an ongoing struggle between the UN, which is urging the states who hold onto these territories to decolonize them, and the states giving reasons for why decolonizing them is unnecessary. We'll have to wait and see which side pulls ahead in that debate. But given as the UN has been chipping away at the former empires bit by bit, like a bowling ball knocking down a couple pins, perhaps they'll get a spare soon. Aside from them, there are also the Cook Islands and Niue, which aren't non-self-governing territories and are actually eligible to join the UN whenever they want to. The reason why they haven't is because both of them have a deal of free association with New Zealand, giving their citizens automatic citizenship in New Zealand. But New Zealand is planning on taking away those citizenship rights if the Cook Islands or Niue were to join, which is a bit too big of a blow for them to take. So for now they enjoy sitting under New Zealand's umbrella. The last batch of states that are still trying to get UN membership are the observer states. But observers aren't just states, but also international organizations like the European Union, intergovernmental organizations like the African Union, and various NGOs. Observers aren't full members of the General Assembly, given as they can't vote on resolutions, but they do get some privileges that non-members don't have. There are two observer states, Palestine and the Holy See. The Holy See, which is like the Catholic Church, kinda, and Vatican City, kinda. We don't have time for any of that. It's pretty much universally recognized by the full UN members, but it doesn't really care to become a member. The Lateran Treaty, which it signed with Italy in 1929, states that the Holy See must be neutral in international matters, which it still upholds. Not that they would get very far if they wanted to become a member anyway, because they'd need a recommendation from the Security Council, which unfortunately for them contains the People's Republic of China, which the Holy See does not recognize, but can of course veto away the recommendation. Speaking of observer states whose recommendations tend to get vetoed away, it's Palestine. Contrary to the Holy See, Palestine does want to become a General Assembly member. Desperately. Since the UN consists of states, being part of the UN would give Palestine indirect recognition as a state, even if some states don't recognize them. So becoming a General Assembly member is a big deal to Palestine. To become one, Palestine needs to pass two hurdles. The second hurdle is to get a 2/3 majority vote in the General Assembly. That one's simple. In May of 2024, the GA passed Resolution ES-10/23, which not only expanded Palestine's rights as an observer, but also urged the Security Council to seriously consider Palestinian membership. Pretty please. 143 states voted in favor, above the 128.66 repeating states that would be required if a vote on Palestinian membership were to ever be held. The first hurdle, however, is to get that dang recommendation from the Security Council in the first place, which is not really a hurdle but more like a tungsten wall. Every single recommendation of Palestinian membership that has gotten into the Security Council has been vetoed away by the United States, and they're not exactly intending to stop anytime soon. In the General Assembly metagame, the observers are C tiers. They can pull off some gimmicks, but are generally not strong. As for the 193 countries that are in the GA, the metagame is a lot more equal. Like I said, every country gets one vote. And also, its resolutions usually aren't binding, and merely show what the general consensus about certain topics is worldwide. So we can just put every country in the GA metagame in like B tier or something. That works. So, EBM, now that you know how UN membership works, I suggest the nation of, Exilia should also try joining. Well, by joining the UN, we must automatically ratify the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which contains the right of freedom of movement, allowing me to escape exile. Wait, why did I say that? So you hate human rights? Fine, wanna form an MUN then? Model United Nations. You know, like we take on the roles of certain countries and act as if we're that country at the UN. Perfect. Let's test it out with... Besides the General Assembly, the Security Council is probably the most well-known organ of the United Nations, and arguably the one that gets the most stuff done. You know, ignoring approving Palestinian membership. Being the organ that has all the power to prevent conflict and impose sanctions on states means that being a member of the Security Council is an incredibly desirable position. Also because you might even get some cash for helping a great power pass an important resolution. But, you know, it's best to keep quiet about that. So desirable that in 1979, it took the General Assembly 154 rounds of voting to decide whether they should send Cuba or Colombia to the Security Council, with each round sluggishly inching forward in Cuba's favor until it peaked in round 123, with 91 out of the 98 required votes, until falling off again, which is when the two decided, okay, no, this is ridiculous, just give it to Mexico instead. The reason why such a fight even occurred was because the Security Council only has 15 seats for the 193 countries that are able to occupy them. And unfortunately for most countries, the seats are slim pickings. Not only are just 10 out of the 15 seats available to them, with the other 5 being reserved for the permanent members, they can also only get a seat that's entitled to the regional group they're in. The African group gets 3, the Asian Pacific group gets 2, the Latin American and Caribbean group gets 2, the Western European and others group gets 2, and the Eastern European group gets 1. Since countries occupy a seat for 2 years, if you're part of the Eastern European group and the seat went to someone else, they have fun waiting out that full term to get another chance. But fear not, for countries can always take advantage of the meta. In order to get into the high tiers of the Security Council non-permanent members, you need to prove that you are willing and committed to maintaining security in the world. How? Well, the SC often organizes peacekeeping missions in various areas of the world where conflicts could possibly resurface. So, countries that either send troops, aka Blue Helmets, or support the mission financially are more likely to gain favor in the General Assembly, allowing them to get elected to the SC. It's no surprise then that Japan has been appointed to the SC the most besides the permanent members, as they're the third largest financial contributor to peacekeeping operations, and the largest if you ignore the 2 permanent members above them. Italy, Germany, and Canada also get elected a lot for the same reason. On the other side of the coin, India and Pakistan benefit a lot from sending some of the most blue helmets out of any country, but oftentimes they don't even beat Nepal, Bangladesh or Rwanda in the amount of troops they send. Though they're mostly doing so because they get paid a lot for it. Same for many other developing countries. Or sometimes they have more malicious motivations, but seriously, we don't have time for that. Countries like those make up the high tiers. So if another country is looking to get elected for the SC, they might copy their strategies and increase the amount of money or blue helmets they send to peacekeeping operations, depending on which works best for them. So it goes without saying that if you want to end up in F tier, you need absolutely no one to trust your ability to keep the world peaceful and secure. See Afghanistan, North Korea, Israel, Eritrea, and worst of all, Iceland. I mean, just look at the cod wars, they're clearly preparing for world domination. But the best way to get into the high tiers of the Security Council metagame, even the S tier, is to not even have to play. The other 5 of the 15 seats belong to the permanent members who are on the Security Council forever. You know them, whether or not you love them is up to your own opinion. It's the US, China, Russia, Britain, and France. The 5 permanent members are also the ones who have the power of veto, which means that if any of them say no to a resolution, regardless of how many other countries voted yes, that resolution is going straight into the trash. The veto is a very controversial aspect of the Security Council, since it has a tendency to completely block progress on a certain topic if a great power feels like it. At this point though, it's literally impossible to get rid of it. Any change to the veto system that weakens it, it's gonna have to go through the Security Council, which is obviously going to veto the change. Rats. So if a nerf to the veto isn't possible, then perhaps we can still change the Security Council structure with DLC. Or, you know, an expansion. You see, there's an ongoing debate about whether or not to increase the amount of permanent and non-permanent members. The main backers of that idea are Brazil, Germany, India, and Japan, all of whom think that they should be given permanent member status. Collectively, they are known as a Group of 4, or G4, and these are the suggestions in their joint proposal made in 2005. The 4 of them get a permanent seat at the SC, alongside 2 permanent seats for the African group, and there will also be 4 more non-permanent seats. Lastly, the new permanent members won't immediately get the power of veto, because there's no way the current permanent members would agree to that. So let's just kick that can down the road and discuss it in about 15 years. Though their demands are linked to each other, not all of them have the same level of support from the veto holders. France and Britain have already agreed to the proposal. France even co-sponsored the demands, continuing the trend of those two not really doing anything with their veto power ever since the Cold War ended. Brazil and India have the most support, since being members of BRICS, an economic group that Russia and China are also parts of, gets them support from those two, while the US doesn't really have a strong opinion. Germany is next, having the support of the US, while Russia and China don't have strong opinions. Japan has it the worst though, because despite the US supporting them and Russia being neutral, getting China to show them any compassion will take a geopolitical miracle. That said though, if the Security Council gives the G4 nations their permanent member status in, let's say patch 3.0, because 2.0 already happened, regardless of whether or not they get a veto, they're shooting up into the S tier. And you know what that means? It's meta centralization. Why bother being any of these suckers in the A tier if there are so many good characters to choose from in the S tier? This shall not stand. And so, in response to the formation of the G4, another group formed in opposition to their bid, Uniting for Consensus. They also want to enlarge the SC, but in a much different way, wanting 10 extra non-permanent members and 0 extra permanent members. The reason why Uniting for Consensus wants to prevent the G4 from becoming permanent members becomes obvious once you look at its members. While the G4 nations are dominant powers in their respective regions, the UFC members are almost dominant powers in those same regions, and so they want to prevent the G4 nations from becoming too powerful. That's Canada, Mexico, Colombia and Argentina against Brazil, Spain, Italy and Turkey against Germany, Pakistan against India, and South Korea against Japan. Oh yeah, and there's also Malta and Costa Rica, they're also there. Even if the 5 veto holders agree to the G4 nations becoming permanent SC members, remember what we talked about earlier, they still need to get a 2/3 majority in the General Assembly. And let's just say the UFC has a bone to pick with that idea. They have a real chance of rallying all of the other UN members to block them, especially if they get the support of China, which actually likes the UFC much more than the G4. Like, yeah, sure, India isn't BRICS with us, but like, do we really want to give one of our biggest geopolitical enemies more power? Yeah, no. Why don't you go play with your good pal Pakistan at the non-permanent member table? Don't worry, he won't bite. And so the current Security Council metagame stays the same, but radical tier shifts may happen in the future. That's because informal groups like the G4, UFC or BRICS have a pretty large impact on decision making in the UN, even if they usually aren't seen as being as powerful as formal organizations. The power of informal groups is a trend you're gonna notice throughout every UN organ. Now, since the resolutions of the Security Council are binding, allow me, as the Security Council President, to put forward a motion that allows Extra to leave exile whenever he pleases. I vote in favor. Darn, he's good. The Economic and Social Council exists to discuss economic and social issues. But actually, we're not even gonna talk about it. ECOSOC itself is kinda weak, so it doesn't really matter too much which countries are in it, and thus its metagame isn't really in-depth. What is important about ECOSOC, however, is that it serves as an umbrella for a bunch of specialized agencies. And while those agencies don't discuss political issues per se, they are still politicized, and so can have an impact on politics. I want to look at one of these organizations specifically, the International Monetary Fund, because I personally think it has one of the most interesting metagames. The IMF's executive board's main purpose is to prevent an economic crisis, which they do by lending money to countries who get themselves into debt. That money has to come from somewhere though, and for the most part it comes from the other member states. Each country pays a certain fee to be part of the IMF, which is called a quota. The stronger a country's economy, the higher their quota, and thus the more they pay. Uh-oh, that sounds like a scam! But it's not really. You see, so far the only voting systems we've talked about have been simple. One country equals one vote, albeit with or without a veto. But if that system was used in the IMF, that would be awful for the richer countries, because they have to pay so much to be a part of it and then they don't even get compensated for it. So the IMF does not use a one country equals one vote system, but instead, the quota also decides a country's voting power. Wow, looks like a metagame instantaneously formed based on each country's economic power, with the United States as the most powerful economy holding a whopping 16.49% of the votes, which is approximately 32 times their voting power in the General Assembly where they only get 1 out of 193 votes. It's so ridiculously high that an 85% supermajority, which is required to make changes to the voting system, is literally impossible to achieve without the US voting in favor. What the actual fuck? So yeah, while the voting system does make sense given the quota payments, the other countries obviously aren't the biggest fans of this arrangement. However, they can't change the voting system to reduce the US's power since they would simply say no. So they have to do the next best thing. Unionize. Kinda. The executive board doesn't actually contain all IMF members, it only contains 25 of them. But several groups of countries rally behind the director of another, giving that country all of their voting power, and that country does the decision making for all countries they represent. This means that the whole world has been split up into 25 pieces, which also tells us a little bit about which countries are on the same wavelength when it comes to preventing economic crises. Some of these groups are to be expected. There's a Nordic bloc, a Southeast Asian bloc, a Southern Asian bloc, an Arab bloc, and a South American bloc. And then 7 of the 25 don't even have to work together with anyone because their voting powers are high enough as is. But then there are those little peculiarities on the map which really makes you think about what went on behind the negotiating table to form these groups. Canada leads a bloc of mostly Anglophone countries, which includes Ireland. Spain and Mexico share a bloc with common Spanish colonial histories. Brazil takes the leftover American scraps, and also Timor-Leste and Cape Verde, which were Portuguese colonies just like Brazil. Portugal itself is part of Italy's bloc, united by Mediterranean culture. Since Europe has plenty of strong economies, they're able to be a lot more picky with who they team up with to get a high enough voting power. That means that the other 2 European blocs we haven't discussed yet are just complete messes. You've got a Dutch and Belgian bloc, as well as an Austrian and Turkish bloc. Something interesting though is that Kosovo is in that latter bloc, despite them not being recognized as one of the UN's 193 main members. Though Serbia and Russia resisted their inclusion, since the US, and by extension Western Europe, have most of the votes in the IMF due to their economic strength, they were able to pull Kosovo in. Being enemies of the US also explains why the likes of Cuba, Venezuela, Western Sahara, Palestine, Afghanistan, and North Korea are not in the IMF. So does that also mean that Serbia and Russia are in the same bloc? No actually. Russia only pools their votes together with one other country, and it's not even in the former Soviet Union. Can you guess who it is? Syria! Boy, I'm sure recent geopolitical developments will definitely not make this IMF relationship incredibly awkward for both parties. It would be sad if it wasn't incredibly funny. But then who do Serbia, Poland, and Switzerland team up with? Central Asia. Sure. I kinda like this bloc because Liechtenstein and Uzbekistan, the 2 double landlocked countries, are teaming up. That's pretty funny. The African blocs are a lot bigger than the European ones because they don't have similarly strong economies, so they have to be a lot less picky when teaming up. South Africa leads a squad of Southern African countries, while the Central African bloc is a lot more evenly spread, with the DRC having the highest voting power. This is unfortunately also the weakest bloc in the executive board despite its size. Nigeria is in charge of a Western African bloc, which surprisingly does not contain Ghana. Ghana instead partners up with the Northern African countries, alongside Iran and Pakistan. And lastly, there's a Pacific bloc which also includes Mongolia and the Seychelles, because they needed some friends too. These are genuinely some of the most bizarro pairings of countries I've ever seen, and it pains me that I don't know what happened behind the scenes that formed them in the first place. But thanks to these pairings, the IMF metagame is a bit more balanced, and allows the smaller countries to also have a say. But considering the Kosovo example from earlier, the metagame is definitely in the West's favor. It's why, once again, informal groups want to challenge it. BRICS already pushed to reform the quota system in 2010 to give emerging economies more voting power, which the US reluctantly agreed to in 2015, as long as they could keep their 16% vote share. BRICS has also made their own institution called the New Development Bank, which acts similarly to the IMF and the World Bank, but without the dominance of the US and other Western powers. And with more countries having joined BRICS in 2024, it looks like the will to challenge the West's economic power is growing internationally. Could this massively shake up the metagame? Maybe. I don't know. I can't predict the future, man. And you know what else will massively shake up our metagame? This fat stack of cash right here. I took out a loan from the IMF. Oh, didn't you hear? They sent an email inviting us right after we finished our MUN meeting where we played as a Security Council. They praised us for our realism regarding the usage of the veto power. Alright then, time to use this money to call an Uber and get me out of this place. Man, inflation's rough these days. While we wait for that to arrive, let's talk about one more metagame. Metagames aren't always about tier lists. Character matchups also play an important role. You know, the US may be S tier, but put them in the ring against Vietnam and let's just call that an upset. But war is not tolerated at the UN, so instead, countries will have to 1v1 in court. The International Court of Justice is the UN organ that settles all kinds of legal disputes. On the surface, the ICJ has the exact same metagame as the General Assembly. It has the exact same 193 member states, and since all 15 judges of the court have to be completely neutral regardless of their nationality, it's not like any country can gain a political advantage by having one of their judges serving. An applicant country can simply challenge a respondent country by claiming they've broken international law, and if they accept, it becomes a contentious case. This makes the battleground pretty even, all things considered. No items, Fox only, final destination. If the applicant wins, then the court punishes the respondent and makes them pinky promise to never break the law again. And if the respondent wins, then the applicant is told to shut up. You know, that but in legal mumbo-jumbo. Who needs wars when you can watch states settle their differences in an epic saga of legal cases? It provides all the drama you need. But when I say, on the surface, the ICJ has the exact same metagame as the General Assembly, the on the surface is the key word. Shut up. Since both parties agree to the 1v1, if the court finds that the respondent has indeed broken international law, they are forced to comply with the court's ruling, often having to pay reparations. If the respondent doesn't comply, then it's the Security Council that's supposed to enforce the ruling. And that's where the main issue of the ICJ lies. Let's take one of the contentious cases currently in progress as an example. Ukraine v Russia. It's about Russia claiming that Ukraine is committing a genocide in Donetsk and Luhansk, justifying Russia's invasion, special military operation. Ukraine submits a claim against Russia saying, "Nuh-uh, we're not committing genocide." And also, "No, you're planning a genocide." Let's consider a future in which Ukraine wins the case. Good day to you, Russian Federation. You have lost the case that Ukraine filed against you and must immediately stop your invasion and pay reparations. I disagree. Well, since you appear to be non-compliant, I must unfortunately bring this case in front of the United Nations Security Council in order to enforce the ruling of the International Court of Justice. Hello Security Council members, we have convened today to vote on a resolution to enforce the International Court of Justice's ruling on the Russian Federation. Please cast your votes. I veto. The resolution has not been adopted, owing to the negative vote of a permanent member of the Council. I shall now give the floor to those members of the Council who wish to make statements after the voting. Yes, actually, I want to make a statement. What the fuck? Democracy is dead. And it's not just the 5 veto holders who enjoy this kind of protection, because they might also cast their veto to protect an important ally. Looking at another ongoing case, for example, South Africa v Israel, in which South Africa claims that Israel is breaking the 1948 Genocide Convention by committing a genocide against Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. For now, the court has only asked Israel to comply by some provisional measures, but if Israel loses the case, when Israel loses the case, they could refuse to comply and have the US veto any Security Council resolution that spawns from it, arguing that Israel is acting in self-defense. Even the most neutral of institutions aren't immune from international politics, so you'd best be at the top of that metagame. Oh hey, my Uber is here, so I guess it's time for me to go. Well then, EBM, my time here has been truly horrendous. There's no but. Goodbye. Huh? For what? You know, according to the ICJ's rules, I don't actually have to agree to this. Oh, you're right! I accept your challenge! You think?